A few weeks back, I heard mention of the Indian skimmer at the lower Manair Dam in Karimnagar. The skimmer is an endangered species and I was keen on documenting it. I was advised instead to head to the Godavari estuary, the second longest river in India, draining the third largest basin in the country, covering about 10% of India's total geographical area. The mangroves here are the second largest mangrove forest in India and home to nearly 50 migratory species of birds. These are part of the vulnerable Godavari Krishna mangroves, a narrow band of mangroves that runs along the middle region coast of the Indian subcontinent. So after a decent drive, we reached the village of Bhairavapalem and took a boat out onto the mudflats. Located in Andhra Pradesh, these mudflats are named after the village and are subject to tidal waters. This is one of the mouths of the river Godavari, the Gautami Godavari, the other being the Vashishta Godavari to the south. This fertile land, surrounded by Godavari's tributaries, including the Vruddha Godavari, Vashishta Godavari, Gautami and Nilarevu, is called the Konasima Delta. Bhairavapalem is also the name of a reserve forest in the Coringa Wildlife Sanctuary. We first saw these unmistakable skimmers as a huge flock of almost 300 birds far out across the mudflats. So our first thought was to work out where they were perching on these mudflats. The tide was receding and we saw the entire flock go to ground on one fairly long stretch of mudflat. The skimmers would take off, fly around in a circle and return to the same flat. I hoped they would skim, but barring the off individual every now and then, they didn't really do any skimming. As the sun dropped behind us, the birds were quite content to stay put, allowing us to gradually make our way closer. There were a few fishing boats in our vicinity, curiously watching our ungainly attempts to approach the birds. And the current was pretty strong with a stiff breeze. So please excuse any stabilization jitters every now and then because the boat was rocking quite a bit. The continuously receding tide exposed more and more patches of mudflats, and we finally got off the boat and made our base on one such flat reasonably close to these birds. These muddy patches are quite slippery and fairly bumpy, but surprisingly, they are very easy to maneuver tripods on, especially if you have the ground pods. As the sun set, we hoped that the birds would live up to their name and skim. But except the odd individual once in a while, the flock didn't really do any skimming. The peace, quiet and rhythmic flight of the skimmers gave me the opportunity to look at some of the other species that inhabit these stunning mangroves. There were numerous waders. There were pratincoles, both the little and the oriental. There was a western reef heron, there were open-billed, painted storks, and there were the predators like the Brahmini kite. Eventually the light turned golden and the tide started to come in. And with this, the activity of the skimmers increased. They became noisier, much more active than before. They didn't seem too concerned about the fishing boats in the vicinity, and you can hear them in the background. I suppose they've gotten used to some of the free food they get from the boats as they fish across the river. The rising tide gradually covered the expanse of mudflats, and the skimmers took to wing.
Hey, some are skimming, man. Some. Oh, yeah. Maybe. Yeah. One or two individuals.
Gradually, as they flew, they started to fly further and further away from us.
they are doing. What shall we do? Release him. What shall we do? Release him.
And finally, tired, wet, and hungry, we called it a day and headed back to the dock with a spectacular sunset chasing us. The next day was a very different scene when we got to the mudflats. The low tide had receded considerably and much further out, exposing massive expanses of the flats. The day was grey, it was completely cloudy, massive banks of grey clouds, and it seemed as though it would rain. We found the skimmers with a number of other species perched peacefully on the far side of the island. And as is the norm, we went to ground and very gradually approached the skimmers. This was our last session with the skimmers, and I was keen on getting close to the skimmers and hopefully try and isolate them to see if I could get maybe 2 or 3, or better still even 1 in the frame. The birds were peaceful and relaxed, and we were able to get fairly close. Some care was needed as we approached the skimmers because we were basically surrounded by very, very skittish birds, and there were a lot of other species too which were equally skittish. So any sudden movements would have put all of them to flight. Then it started to rain. Eventually, the rain slowed down to a drizzle and the colors brightened. I made my way a bit closer but decided against moving anymore and just took in the sight of these beautiful and endangered skimmers resting. This was my final sighting before we decided to call it a day and started back home with the promise that I will return again soon.